Good morning, friends. This is the lesson that we were going to be doing today, but with internet and everything, it got cut short. So today I want to spend some time briefly dealing with major concepts that are focused on with Frankenstein, the novel. So we'll be looking at themes, we'll be looking at motifs, we'll be looking at some symbols, just to make sure that we're really attentive to the focal points that I believe Mary Shelley wanted us to draw away from and have conversations about, at least if not for her. I definitely want to make sure that we do that. So let's go through this. A reminder for you before we really dig into this about themes and the definition of it. You may recall that themes are fundamental or universal ideas that are explored in a work. If you have gone through our system, you may have seen that there's a lot more development with that. Because a theme is, yes, a main controlling idea of a story, but it also has to be in the form of a sentence. It can't just be one word. So when you see my slides, you'll notice that they're based on topics more than they are themes, things that you would need to address. But themes are the actual statements that are made based on that idea, and then the unpacking of it. So a theme has to be a main controlling idea, yes. It has to be a universal truth, yes, which means it has to apply to both the story and to the world around us. It does have to be in the form of a sentence, and that sentence cannot be a cliche, right? So a common everyday phrase, it also shouldn't be an idiom either. It's not a moral of a story. And the last key with a theme is that it requires further conversation. Right, so if it can't do all of those things, it doesn't fit those check marks of being a main controlling idea of a story, being in the form of a sentence, being a universal truth, applying to both the story that you're dealing with and also to the world around. It is not a cliche and it requires further discussion. Then you actually haven't developed your statement enough to analyze. Okay, so just as we keep moving forward, just be mindful of that. So the first thing I want to dig into briefly is the idea of knowledge. So that's going to be our topic. Knowledge is quite widespread, right? If you look to the Platonic idea of what knowledge is when you have gone through all your senses and opinions and you have tested against abstraction, you've gathered new insights, you've seen other perspectives outside of your own ideas, and then you have gained knowledge and understanding that continues to grow, right? Knowledge isn't just about checking things off the list. It's about moving forward. It's about gaining and accumulating more stuff. So part of it is just if we deal with it that way, we have to look at knowledge in terms of like a breakdown of everything. So it has to be something like why is this valuable? So not just the acquisition of knowledge, right? So how do we gain it, but also then how do we use it? For starters, to acquire knowledge means, again, you have to gain insight, whether that's from books or that's from people or that's from lessons that you've learned, right? So to have knowledge means that you've had experiences and you've gained insight and you've tested it as well. If we look at the novel, to acquire knowledge for Victor was to learn life lessons, and he talked about main controlling things for him as to what defined him, right? The lightning bolt striking down the tree and completely obliterating and the power that is, the idea of life and death, Monsieur Kremp and Monsieur Waldman in the teachings of everything as to what is focused on stuff, the idea of Galvani and Volta, the idea of Kabbalists and alchemists and Cornelius Agrippa, right? All those things are what brings Victor to this place of knowledge and understanding. And he takes that knowledge and goes to that second step of using this knowledge to then make further advancements, to make further observations, right? So to take the ideas of Galvani and Volta, to take the idea of death and morbidity and the study of life itself, and to use those and combine them all into the idea of exploring, could I possibly create life from death? Could I start over again, right? And he spends years, I believe it's a year and a half or 2 years, just isolated and alone, and we'll get to that topic later, dealing with how can I use this knowledge to advance the science field, to advance humanity even. And there's a power with that. He actually identifies that he wants to gain notoriety with this. He says, I could be the first person that does this type of thing. I could be up there in the upper echelons of science people with really foundational members of this initial group. But along with that power that this knowledge imbibes, it's possibly also important that we identify that to have knowledge means that you also have understanding, right? You have forethought. You have the idea of understanding what this knowledge can do, right? It requires some sort of morality. It requires ethical decision making. It requires, what do I do in this context? It requires common sense, rational thinking. Because just because you have the knowledge doesn't mean that that's going to be healthy for you. It doesn't mean that's going to be good for you, or forget you. It doesn't mean it's going to be good for the community in which you're giving it. I know a lot of things, right? You know a lot of things. It doesn't mean those are healthy things to know. But at the same time, maybe it's good that I know them, but it doesn't mean that other people need to know them at certain points in their life, right? Or that it would benefit them to know that information, right? So knowledge can be dangerous. It can be fearful. I think of our world today. I think about the dire consequences of behavior. And maybe it was thought out. Maybe there was intent. Maybe there was some sort of rational thought process that went with, why would I do this? But the impact of those things also mean a lot, right? And that's the part that we questioned in class as to the idea of why does he not have forethought, especially if Victor is the modern Prometheus, right? Why is it that he didn't think ahead and think that there could be detriments to his ambition? Lots to unpack here, which is why you have the symbol of danger here, because if you're going to acquire knowledge, there are consequences for that, good and bad, right? But you have to be aware of them and you have to be able to deal with them. The next idea, and we've talked about this briefly too along the way here, is the idea of man's place in the natural element, in the natural world. Some have always labeled this as being like the idea of nature being sublime, right? An escape, and there are keys with that. But there's also the idea that mankind alone struggles with being isolated, being in this natural element, because it's almost an unnatural fit. Because nature can go on without mankind. It doesn't need mankind in this thing. So to have them juxtaposed in there, to have them combined in here as to a selfishly driven thing and then just this natural element of something, there is a beauty that comes with this. We are told that biblically, right, that God walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day, right, that you're supposed to be immersed into the natural elements of things. We are told now, for mental health's sake, that we are told to get outside and walk, right, and to see the natural elements of our world, to not be confined to just, well, I'm in my basement right now, but not to be confined to four walls, right? To be outside, to experience the world, to feel the earth underneath your feet, to see the grandiose beauty that can be presented to you. And sometimes that's hard, but it's freeing, it's liberating, right? So in the story, Victor, whenever he gets caught up in his things, he needs to escape, right? When Henry Clerval comes and brings him away from the study, the science room, he takes him away and he gets him outside, he gets him outdoors, he exposes him to things after he heals him with soup and everything like that. We get really beautiful descriptions of Mont Blanc and Chamonix and the Alps and the description of this. And the interesting thing for me is that as we see these things, we see Victor heal, right? And then there does come that point in the novel where that healing also now gets corrupted because the monster's also figured out that that's where he belongs as well, because it's away from people, right? So when the monster brings Victor and gives his demands, it's in nature. It's surrounded by this beautiful thing. So there's this aesthetic that comes with this as to mankind belongs with other people, but it also needs to coexist in the beauty of the surroundings and the blessings with there, which is why also we have Robert Walton, who is stuck in the north, right, trying to find this passageway for his expedition, and Victor telling him this story. We isolate him out there too, because we're going to have to bring him back at some point. We're going to have to bring the story back. We're going to have to bring everything back to Margaret Seville and get back to land. And to do that means that we have to be alone. We have to be dealing with that. So not to be all philosophical or theological, but how do you stay grounded if you're not able to be alone, but knowing when to be alone and when not to? And that's actually going to carry over into other things that we deal with. So you'll see the next slide here. I had to throw a Disney thing in here just for my love of everything. You got Pixar's Monster Inc. You got Sully and you got Mike here. But the idea of monstrosities, right? And this doesn't just apply to the creation that Victor has so wonderfully crafted. It could just be the ominous pieces of things, right? So yes, it is the grotesque, as the monster even calls himself, the grotesque demon, the wretch that's there. It just could be something that's looming over these, the heavy-weighted things that scare people, the presence of something that is crushing and coming down on you, the oppression that you would feel. It could be a building, right? That's a monstrosity. It could be an idea. Maybe an idea is a monstrosity. But just this overwhelming thing that either creates fear in you or that is looking too tough to handle. Something that's just maybe grotesque and unique and weird. If you've ever gone to the grocery store and found that weird carrot, it's a monstrosity. I've never said that. Those are usually the ones I pick up. But not only that, these are things that people possibly encounter, but how also do we encounter these things? How often do we see these things not as beautiful things, but as ugly things? And we talked about a connection to Samuel Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner as a foundation for how the story is structured and the pathway of Victor having to tell his story this way, almost reminiscent of Coleridge's protagonist. But in that poem, in that 7-part poem, the main character, the mariner, kills an albatross and this odd, horrible sounding bird, which is of good luck, and then everything falls apart from there. But then he's forced to be in encounter with nature. He's forced to look into the sea, and he sees like sea snakes, and he sees these serpents, and they are grotesque, they are ugly, they are monstrosity, they're ginormous things. And he looks at them, and he does have this moment of ew, but then he goes even further than that and says, but there's something beautiful about them. They're shiny, glimmery, splendor. Sorry, I had to quote 11 there too. There's something beautiful in their formation, their struggle that is God created, that is beautiful, right? And he comes to the realization that all things under God's provisions are beautiful, right? Just like we talked about in the last slide about nature and how beautiful it is and how natural it is. There's got to be beauty in ugliness too. And when you deal with philosophy next year, or you have me for studies in literature or whatever, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about aestheticism, we'll talk about movement, we'll talk about art for art's sake. And just because we deem it to be ugly doesn't mean that it actually is ugly. It's just different, right? So how do we look at the things that are monstrosities to us? And how do we look at ourselves if we consider ourselves monsters as well? So I'll leave that in that pocket. Obviously, we can talk about that for a while because the whole story revolves around the creation, right? And how he sees himself and how the world sees him and how he's trying to figure that out. We talked about this in the multiple sides, and I hope you notice also that while we talk about these things, they are interconnected, they are layered. So you would be very hard pressed to not mention other things while you're unpacking a specific topic, right? So the idea of alienation, isolation, and being, that's kind of our main focal point for the semester, becomes at the root of everything. To be alone, which requires you to have space and time. It requires you to be contemplative, meditative, reflective. You could either be alienated by your own self-desire and passion to do that, right? So you can just walk away from a situation for whatever reason, whether you need the peace and quiet or you're just sitting there going, the situation I'm in is toxic, so I just can't do that. Or you can be forced, right? Which is the one we always focus on, as to I'm not welcome here, or I'm bullied out of that, right? But either one is still considered alienation, and to be different, to be alienated, to be an alien, to be labeled as such, and to be pushed away from the culture or from the society. I think this is very apparent. I think you'll figure that out pretty quick as to, does this work or not, right? Victor does it to himself, and we see the consequences for that. The monster is forced into that from how society treats him and how his father, his creation, has treated him. Either way, spending too much time is not good, right? So it's good to be alone. If you're an introvert, that's great, but there needs to be some sort of interaction, whether that's with one other person or two other people. You don't need to be a part of a big group. You don't need to be the life of the party. You don't have to be the entertainer, which is typically what I do in default, just to do that. But if I have my opportunity, I'd rather be pulling away. Like, this is kind of a nice setup for me. It's peaceful, it's quiet, it allows me to be in my own thoughts a little bit, and to work through some things, right? So just as this gentleman here is gazing out into the vast sea, he's looking in a direction. He's looking at something that he's longing for. Yes, it's peaceful. Yes, it's serene. Yes, it's thought-inducing. I don't think he's going to stay here for years, right? He's not going to stay here for months. He's not going to stay here for days. He's only going to stay here for a little bit. Then he's going to move forward and make a plan and to step ahead, right? So it's okay to be isolated. It's okay to choose that. It's never okay to be forced into that, but sometimes you find good in that too. But we always have to address it for what it is. With these choices that we're making, with the reflections, when we talked about knowledge, we talked about alienation, we talked about monstrosities, we talked about nature, we talked about all these things. There is always in this novel an element of morality, what is right and wrong. And we have to be careful to say that right and wrong, morality and ethics are individual thoughts. They are personal to people. So we can't call other people's morals and ethics into question. I mean, we do all the time, right? We judge them. But it's really an individual idea as to what they deem to be right given their circumstances. But we do have common understandings, right? We talked about the idea of thou shalt not murder. That's a common thing. That's a moral thing that is here. But we also mentioned briefly earlier in the semester about this cognitive dissonance, right? We are put in a situation where we have two bad things that we have to choose between. And they might go against everything that we are, but given the circumstances, these are our only two options. And we may sway in our morality to choose the lesser thing to make life easier. And we have to justify that. We have to explain that and say why it's, when we have to rationalize it. This is Victor's warning to Robert Walton, right? Because Robert Walton in the beginning, when they were talking and meeting each other and reviving Victor back into health on the boat, they said, Victor, the story goes that Robert Walton was willing to sacrifice life. And Victor says, how dare you think that your advancements are more important than the life of your crew? He's like, let me tell you my story and you will dash that cup from your lips, right? And that's how we get this I am from birth a Genovese, and we go into this whole spiel, and we get 24 chapters of beautiful work. Just because we think something is right or wrong also now goes back into our knowledge of whether we think it or not really doesn't matter. It's about how is it perceived, how is it interpreted, and maybe it might have been right at the time, but now it's wrong in the circumstances, right? So we can be right and wrong, and it requires truth, it requires honesty, it requires unpacking, and transparency, which I think is kind of pivotal in our exploration of what knowledge is, right? We have to be truthful, whatever that may mean. We can't keep secrets. So, here we go. All right, let me move forward a little bit. Let me just quickly go through this. I know this has been 20 minutes so far, so I want to keep it to a nice contained thing. So I've already gone past what I wanted to do. But motifs are typically metaphors and symbols that are that continually show up in a work. These ideas usually help us develop themes that allow us to talk about them more. But you'll see a few things show up in this novel that you'll see show up in other novels too. They're quite I don't want to say infamous, but they're very very acceptable routine things that you would be able to see, especially in the time period, especially in 1818. Right. So we've already talked about the idea of motifs, the idea, but the idea of books, the idea of literature and how valuable literature is, right? This whole novel, yes, we unpack that, but in it, there are multiple moments along the way of references, allusions to things, right? We have the Bible stories. We have Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. We have Paradise Lost from John Milton. We have Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Mutability is sitting right in here, like she had to bless him with putting his poem in there. There is the Arabian Nights story, Sinbad in here, so on and so forth, right? But the value of texts also shows up in the idea of the monster, the creation, finding that journal in that pocket that he took when he left the house the first time, right? And learning how to read it and the value of what he unpacks in here, which is why he hunts and kills William and then brings Victor to demand a wife. Texts are valuable. They are resources for us. They are important to us, right? And if we can see them multiple times along the way, then we can make those connections that we need to say books are important, reading is important. It's information, knowledge acquisition sort of things. I hope you also noticed how gender is portrayed in this work, the need for women, right, and their value, but also their passivity in how they receive information, right? Margaret Saville is passive. She's the one receiving the letters from Robert Walton, right? We don't ever hear from her. We never hear her voice. Caroline Beaufort, Victor's mom, she is not passive at all. She is very active, but we see what happens to active women. They succumb to the pressures of everything. They actually, in their giving of themselves, they fall apart. Elizabeth Lavenza, I would dare say she is kind of in between what passive and active are. She follows in her footsteps of her mother and does help out, but she's also very out of the loop. She's not very able to do anything. She has to deal with the environmental pieces a bit and can't fix anything. She has to call Victor back to fix everything. But yeah, the role of women of the early 1800s and up until that point, even you could go even further and you could say women in general as a stereotype have always been viewed as being passive, of being the receiver of everything and just kind of be in the background. And for me, the irony is, it's funny that we say that, we do that, and yet we study women throughout our literary canon. We study Anne Radcliffe, we study Jane Austen, we study Mary Shelley, and we now need their voices, right? And we get to a fuller sense of who they are and what the society was, because they not only show this stuff, but that because they took risks and they reached out. I'm going to skip that one. It's not as valuable to our conversation right now, but to the cancel culture idea. But symbols, just quickly, I'm not going to deal with that today either. But there's many symbols that show up, like fire, light, rain, um, things that are what they are, but then they also mean something deeper. But we'll talk about that another time. But that's my, I guess, not so quick study of theme with you for Frankenstein. Thank you for joining me and watching the whole thing. And I look forward to touch base. If you have any questions, please reach out. And I look forward to hearing from you soon. All right, but take care of yourselves. Have a great day, and we'll connect next time.